All right, so a couple of kind of obvious questions to start with that I want for this presentation. I want to discuss why exactly photography is important to the production of identity and why exactly I chose to analyze domestic photography for the purpose of understanding the modern alienation of our identity. So to start with some kind of questions about photography, it's hard to really consider it because it is such a daily practice that is entrenched into the way that we understand the world. So it's hard to really reckon with what exactly photography gives us and what exactly photography does, because they are so ubiquitous. And they are a primary mode of communication for the modern day. And in that way, we also use photographs to understand and create our own fashion of identity. So the first thing I want to point out is that there's something very strange about photographs. Because they are extra linguistic, because they require language to mediate and provide context, they are these bizarre fragments of reality that often fail to easily explain themselves. So they're constantly contradicting themselves and often fail to really be meaningful in a way that is unified and objective. Furthermore, photographs lend a bizarre kind of immortality because they allow us to project ourselves outward into a materiality. However, this process of projecting ourselves outward actually alienates us from ourselves by disconnecting us and creating an outward sense of ourself that we are then forced to interpret and read. So domestic photographs are primarily comprised of snapshots, which is a style that imitates everyday and ordinary photographs. And I'll bring one of these up. There we go. Peter Galassi, in his statement for the Museum of Modern Art's photography exhibition, The Pleasures and Terrors of Domestic Comfort, explains this about snapshots. Perhaps the most ubiquitous of all photographs, snapshots are also the most hermetic. To the insider, to the member of the family, snapshots are keys that open reservoirs of memory and feeling. To the outsider, who does not recognize the faces or know the stories, they are forever opaque. At the same time, because we all have snapshots of our own, and thus know the habit of understanding them, we are all equipped to imagine ourselves into the snapshots of others, into the dramas and passions they conceal. Thus, it is important to remember that the language of photography is a language of secrecy, is a language of interpretation. So the second thing I want to consider about photography and why it is important is because there is a sense of reality to it. And that's the challenge with it, is that it's hard to really reckon with how photographs exactly produce truth, because they contain a fragment of reality, but it is never the entirety of reality. So the way that I presented this in my paper was that photography creates a catalog, that we use photography to catalog the world around us. And the way that I'm defining this is that a catalog is an amalgamation of fragments to create a seemingly comprehensive presentation of this particular subject. So for example, if you were to look at a fashion catalog, you are kind of expecting that that is going to give you a comprehensive presentation through these fragments of this is fashion. So in a way, when we look at photographs, we are getting these snippets of the world that we can then interpret to kind of use inductive reasoning to understand this specific instance to the general. Photography is an extension of vision, and it suggests that to see is to know and to understand the thing that is photographed. And like I said, it is never the whole. It is only ever the part that we see, that we only ever see fragments of the thing. So whenever we imagine that we understand something through seeing photographs, we are using a kind of faulty logic in attempting to reckon with what we're seeing. And in this way, photography is a medium that is centered around questions of existence and non-existence, around death, deterioration, and dissolution. We use photographs to extend human presence, to freeze ourselves and immortalize ourselves in a way that we otherwise would not be able to. Susan Sontag in On Photography explains, photography is the medium of what is lost, transmuting in an instant, present into past, life into death. So I think the important thing I want to present about photography is that it catalogs our disappearance. It allows us to see what is lost. So then why then is the domestic an important symbol to write about and to research? I believe that, and others have also theorized, that the domestic represents a metonym for cultural values. Peter Glassie, again, in this same exhibition statement, explains, there is room to argue that domestic life is a subject of broad importance. In the 1980s, the political right and left rediscovered the bitterness of their mutual antipathy, nowhere more deeply than in their shared conviction that the home is a major battleground of social struggle. In one sense, the domestic represents the capitalist conquest of nature, this colonial impulse to control and make space useful. But the home itself also represents the norm. It represents what it means to belong in a society. And often, as this photograph represents, this photograph of Robert Adams, it's this, and of course there's not a white picket fence in this photograph, but that kind of mutually understood motif of the white picket fence is powerfully suggestive of belonging, namely for white heterosexual middle or upper class families. And what's unusual about this photograph, which is from a series called Summer Nights Walking, is that it has this undertone of, it's a very sinister looking photograph. It doesn't feel welcoming and belonging. It has this darkness, and it points far more to exclusion rather than belonging. So as we are seeing now, especially, and access to domestic space is tenuous. Rented spaces are tenuous because a tenant is only ever a missed payment away from living on the street. And as we're seeing in the current housing crisis, at least in the United States, owning a house through a loan isn't much safer either. This is a very disturbing idea because home is a place that should represent, or as we might imagine, it should represent some kind of belonging and safety. Instead, it becomes a site of anxiety. Furthermore, the domestic is also the center of Freud's and Heimlich, the anxiety that is induced by a convergence of the familiar and the unfamiliar. So these photographs of the domestic illustrate our alienation, that capitalism is a system of marginalization. And as we can see in this photograph by Todd Hito, there's this indication that even further than Robert Adams' photograph, that we are disconnected even further. We're located on the other side of a fence, and this pile of refuse is where we are, and that lies just on the outside of this domestic space. So there's this kind of tension here that you're seeing where this uncivil kind of destruction is kind of pushing in on the boundaries of the domestic. And it always is pushing in on the boundaries of the domestic because it is not as stable of a space as we might imagine it to be, as it seems to be, or is promised to be, that is. Capitalism itself is centered around reinvention. So the ethos of capitalist production is that the development of space is to maximize profitability. Everything is only as valuable as it can be made profitable. Nothing is sacred. Therefore, the effacement of solidity in domestic space has forced us to export our sense of belonging into memory, which itself has in turn been supplanted by photographs, because we often, as I danced around a little bit earlier, explained that photographs are used as a kind of proto-memory. We use them to actually supplement ourselves, and it's a way that we can understand and look at ourselves. Susan Sontag again explains on Bernice Abbott's project of cataloging the changing New York in the early 20th century. She is not so much memorializing the past as simply documenting 10 years of the chronic self-destruct quality of American experience, in which even the most recent past is constantly being used up, swept away, torn down, thrown out, and traded in. And again, we can see this in this discarded heap of garbage pushing in on this domestic space, that you cannot understand the domestic space without understanding the byproduct of it, what is rejected and what is marginalized. And then the last photograph that I have to show is James Cazebeer's Subdivision with Spotlight. And he really illustrates through this model of a cul-de-sac, this idea of capitalist homogenization, and asks this question of what does it mean to live in a society that simultaneously values and precludes individualism? How can we excel in a society that both values the status quo and equally values authenticity and creativity? Our spaces, which are representative of our identity, are haunted by this longing, this desire for solidity. We use photography to reckon with anxiety over humanity's slow disappearance. How then can we understand ourselves through any sense of authenticity when we can only access a nostalgic longing for a constructed past? So I want to conclude again with a quote from Susan Sontag's On Photography. The photographer's insistence that everything is real also implies that the real is not enough. In modern society, a discontent with reality expresses itself forcefully and most hauntingly by the longing to reproduce this one. From being out there, the world comes to be inside photographs. Thank you.